Welcome back to the Learning to Thrive podcast. In this episode, we're going to be discussing humility, a subject that isn't always that fun to talk about because we tend to talk about it most when we need it, not when we already have it. But as we dive into the biblical example of humility, of what it looks like to have a heart that is modeled after Christ's, we're going to learn a little bit more how this pertains to the skill of thanksgiving, developing this appreciation for God and an ability to receive all that He provides for us. So as we discuss today, I think you'll see that humility doesn't always have to be demeaning. It's not this pressing down of your self-esteem or anything like that, but a true attitude of humility that is modeled after Christ and His example can actually be quite empowering, not just to yourself, but to those around you. So, Pastor Brooks, would you take just a moment and tell us, from the life of Christ, what is it that we can learn from Christ about developing an attitude of humility?
I'm struck by Philippians 2, this super important passage where we see what Christ did on our behalf. That He, although He had all of the worth that God had invested in Him, He took on human form. We know that human form is not all that it's cracked up to be, but Christ was willing to take the form of a human and submit Himself to God's plan and purpose for His life. And because of that, He experienced the glory, and it was lifted above every other name, and all of those kinds of things that we read in Philippians chapter 2. So I want to start by just thinking about an example that any of us who are adults have probably experienced at one time or another. So picture this, and I'll say it from my own perspective, and where this situation especially comes up is when you are sitting around the dinner table, maybe at a nice restaurant, and all of a sudden the waiter or waitress comes and they set the check in front of you. Maybe I'm sitting with my father-in-law, and there's that awkward moment where you go, okay, you can have it. No, let me do it, right?
Yeah.
There's this awkward exchange of who's the authority here, who's the person who's wanting to take this burden of payment and give a gift to everybody else. Or you could say, well, maybe we should just split it evenly. But the reality is if I, as the son-in-law, say, no, you can't take it. You take it every time. It's my turn to pay. There's something in that can hurt the heart of my father-in-law, right?
Yeah.
Because he takes it as part of his responsibility, part of his opportunity to give blessing to his children. It's not an act of humility on my behalf if I say, oh, no, this is my turn. I demand that you allow me to pay right now.
Yeah.
That's not an act of humility. Just in the same way, it's not an act of humility as if I say, okay, you can do. There's a sense of false humility there as well.
Yeah.
Instead, what my father-in-law is hoping, I think at least, it's always hard to read father-in-laws, what I think he's hoping for is that I show a willingness to allow him to take that, to give me a blessing, and to show a humble heart of thanksgiving. So when we talk about the practice of humility, it's in an interesting place here in our Thrive ecosystem, right?
Yeah.
It's not just a way that I treat others, but it's under the faith skill of thanksgiving. It's a way for me to show thanksgiving, not just on a human level, but to God as well.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. And we've been intentional about where we've placed humility in our practices under the skill of thanksgiving, but it's also in the environment of discovering who God is. And so the more we grow in humility, what we're saying through this structure is that not only will we grow in our ability to appreciate what God has given and receive what He's provided for us, but also that as we grow in humility, we're going to be able to discover more who God is. So let's start with that, Pastor Brooks, and let me just ask you, can you define humility? What is humility? How is this going to help us discover who God actually is?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and I think it's a good place to start. Even though humility in this context, we're talking about our relationship with God and the way that we receive the gifts that God has given us. That's
Sure.
how discover who God is comes into play with it. But in order to understand where humility has to play in that position, I think we have to look at humility even from a human perspective. So, one of my favorite jokes that my dad ever used to tell, and one that when I was a kid I really appreciated, when he'd meet somebody new, he might say something like, "Hey, I'm so and so. Have you ever read my book? It's called Humility and How It Made Me Great."
Bestseller, huh?
Yeah, definitely, and it's one that we can all relate to, right?
Yeah.
But it's funny. It's a funny joke because it's so obviously hypocritical, right? And it's self-deprecating, and there's something in there that speaks to our soul. Like, we know that a lot of us we really think that deep down inside, but it's not the kind of thing that we can just come right out and say, right?
Sure.
So humility, when we think of it, sometimes we think of humility as this like perspective of life where I'm not allowed to boast at all. I'm not allowed to highlight
Yeah.
any of my good things. And in fact, I should find the bad things about me and highlight those maybe to bring myself low. But that's not really what humility is at all. Instead, humility, there's a kind of a common phrasing about humility, is not thinking less of yourself, but thinking about yourself less.
So this isn't just about a low self-esteem or wallowing in self-pity then, right? This isn't just woe is me and I want to make sure everybody else knows that I know that I'm so lowly. What is it then about humility that causes us not just to think lowly of ourselves, but to spend less time dwelling on our own selves, our own accomplishments, and putting our focus and our attitude on other people?
Yeah, exactly. That it's not just making myself feel low and worthless, but just saying not everything is about me. It's an understanding of what reality is without this kind of pretense or trying to pretend that something is either better than it is or worse than it really is, but approaching it and saying, this is what reality actually looks like. And that's a better understanding of how we should understand humility.
So that makes a lot of sense as to how humility can help us discover who God is. If God is truth and he lives in reality, then the more we live in that same reality, we discover who he is. So this isn't artificially inflating things or even artificially deflating things, but just treating them as they actually are. So now I know who I am, I know who God is, and I know what God has done for me.
Yeah, certainly. And that especially comes up in our relationship with God and with other people in this kind of transaction of gift giving. We're talking about Thanksgiving here, and gift giving is a major part of Thanksgiving.
Yeah.
How well do you receive the gifts that God or other people have given you? So a kind of false humility might think higher of myself, like I don't need any help. I'm self-sufficient. I am pretty important as it is, and this world couldn't really go on without me in my current capacity, right?
Yeah.
That's not humility at all. So one experience that I find myself in fairly frequently as a children and family pastor is at the end of service on Sunday morning, I'm putting away craft supplies, putting away chairs, all this kind of stuff. And inevitably somebody will peek their head around the corner and say, "Hey, Pastor Brooks, do you need a hand?" And my completely unhumble heart says, "No, that's okay. I'm okay, thank you. Don't worry about it. You go, you be able to talk to people, you be able to go be with your family or whatever that might be." But what I'm really doing in that opportunity is stealing an opportunity for them to show blessing, to give blessing, and to sow in to the ministry of the church or the kids or whatever it might be.
Okay, well, I see how that plays into our relationship with others, then obviously. So can you talk for a moment about how this plays into our relationship with God?
Yeah, well, we know that God, as the perfect Father, really enjoys and loves giving gifts to his children, right? God gives us all sorts of gifts, whether it's spiritual gifts and the ways that we can be and interact and create the church that he has put us into. It might be material blessings. It might be all kinds of things that God wants to sow into our life, that we have to open our eyes and see, where is God actually present in our lives? Where is he wanting to bless us? Where is he wanting to challenge us even?
Yeah.
A lot of the times, the gifts that God gives us are not things that we might think of as gifts, but they're opportunities that God wants to shape us, to form us, to make us new.
Okay, so given that, what then are some practical things that we can do that will help put us in a posture or position to begin to receive from God?
Well, I think the very first thing is to open my eyes and see how active God is in the world around me, how active God is in my life in every moment of every day. Not necessarily that he's telling me which kind of Cheerios to eat in the morning, but God is shaping my life. God wants to form me as a human being, as a Christian who follows him. So I have to first open my eyes and see, what is it that he's telling me? Sometimes overtly and sometimes very subtly. But if I'm going to see and hear those things, I have to have that heart of humility. I have to be able to recognize that I am not self-sufficient. I am not Lord of my own life. I am not more important than God says that I am. I'm not less than that, but I'm not more.
Sure.
It's a recognition of what is the reality that God has put in front of me. What does he want to teach me and show me, and how is he going to help me walk through each of these steps? So I have to be willing and ready to receive those gifts from God, first of all. But secondly, I think it might go a little bit deeper than that. That not just do I have to have this kind of passive readiness to see what God is doing, but sometimes I think I have to be the active party. And God wants me to show that I am willing to depend on him. I'm willing to set my reputation on God acting in my life.
Yeah.
That I have to be ready for God to be the source of my life, the source of my provision, and not just say, God, I'll take whatever you can give me, but say, God, I'm not going to take another step right here until you show me that you're moving in my life.
Yeah.
That can be a very a scary position to walk into, to say, I'm not in control. God is the one who's in control here.
That's another famous axiom, that it's amazing how much work will get done when people aren't concerned with who gets the credit. So putting yourself in a position where God can work through you and utilize you, and you're not worried about your reputation or what this is going to look like to outsiders or anyone else. There's also the anti-axiom. It's amazing how much work will get done when people are concerned with who gets the credit. So there's definitely a darker side to humility, this idea and concept of false humility. So can you talk with us about that for just a moment, and what is false humility, and what does it look like, and why can that be so sinister?
I think really at the heart of false humility is a sort of insecurity with who I am, right? And an ego-centered version of, I really don't think very highly of myself, but in order for me to be noticed, in order for me to make a name for myself, I have to almost go the other direction and be self-deprecating. I have to, really be searching for compliments. I have to feign this kind of weakness and powerlessness in my life. But at the heart of all of that is just insecurity because I haven't been seen. Insecurity because I haven't been recognized for who I hope that I truly am down inside. And so that false sense of humility is really something that we have to work through as well. Yeah. And that especially comes down to our relationship with God and understanding who God really says that we are. That's where we keep coming back to, is what is the truth here? That God recognizes that I am his child, that I am loved, that I am valued, that I am someone that he has wanted to invest these gifts in. And if I'm ready to receive those gifts, then I can walk forward with thanksgiving and appreciation and humility in who he says that I am.
So in our definition of thanksgiving, we call it a proper attitude towards God and receiving what he provides. So I'd like to take us back to the biblical example for a moment. And what does the Bible have to tell us about the proper attitude towards God and making sure that our hearts are in the right place so that we can receive what he provides.
Yeah. One of my favorite stories in the Old Testament is in the book of Deuteronomy. The Israel here is like sitting on the brink of the Jordan River, just about to enter into the promised land. They're like looking and dreaming and seeing what they've hoped for years and years and years.
Yeah.
And in Deuteronomy chapter 8 and 9, Moses has kind of a heart-to-heart with them, right? He has this moment where he's like, life has been difficult the last 40 plus 400 years. That you have not known anything except for difficulty. And in the midst of that difficulty, there have been times where you've grumbled and complained and you've received the consequences of that. But it's been easier to see where God has been active, right? We've seen the pillar of cloud. We've seen the plagues and all these kinds of things. But Moses says, don't forget, once you get into the land, once you cross this river and things all of a sudden become a little bit easier, the land is flowing with milk and honey and things are taken care of for you. When you get into that situation, it's going to be so easy for you to forget God, to forget what he's done for you, to put out of your mind the gifts that he's given you, because it's just out of sight, right? And Moses follows up in chapter 9 and he says, don't make any mistake. It's not because of anything that you, Israel, have done. You're not high and mighty. You're not super amazing. All of the gifts that God has given you don't really say anything about you.
Sure.
But they say everything about the God who is giving those gifts to you.
Okay, so taking a cue from the life of Moses and learning from his example, when we were talking about the practice of appreciation earlier, one of the things that we mentioned is that recognition is an important part of appreciation. In order to be able to appreciate the gift, you have to recognize that you've been given a gift. So how does that idea of recognition, coupled with humility, join together and play an important role in our ability to receive what God is trying to do in our lives?
Yeah, well, we talked a couple minutes ago about first just opening our eyes and being aware and expecting God to move in our lives, expecting God to be active in all of these places. That I have to open my eyes and say, I know that God is going to be active, and I need to identify those. Maybe I need to write them down even.
Yeah.
And in humility, not saying, oh, no, that wasn't God. That was something I did. In humility, that says, oh, no, I saw God was active. God was moving right there. He did something. And then when God does move in my life, when God is active in my life, I need to use those gifts as he intended. So for Israel, as they enter into the land, not to start thinking high and mighty about themselves, but to say, wow, look what God has done. Yeah. We need to have an attitude of worship. We need to have an attitude of obedience. We need to have an attitude of following the plan that he designed as he gave us these gifts.
Yeah, so another thing that Israel was really good at was marking those times and remembering those moments and celebrating them. And so is that concept of marking these moments and remembering them and celebrating them in our families, is that something that we can carry into our family life now?
Yeah, certainly. It's so important for us not just to say like, God was active, that's interesting, but to be thankful in that, to set aside time where you can talk with friends and family and your church, your small group, talk with people about what God has done for you and celebrate those things. That when you've been praying for something and you've been agonizing for something in your life and pouring your heart out before God, and God answers you, celebrate God's answer. Even if it looks different than what you were expecting, recognize where God has been active and celebrate his activity in your life.
So our sin nature wants to just hold on to these things. But humility, appreciation, generosity, some of these other practices are going to lead us to take what God has given us, and instead of figuring out, how much I can hoard and how much I can, hold on to, instead an attitude of humility says, man, this is all like God's gift to me, but not just to me. How can I use this to bless others? And how can I take what God has provided and turn it into a source of blessing and provision for those around me, for the world? Now, humility, a far cry from being low self-esteem and thinking lowly of myself, humility leads me into this attitude of I can be a blessing to others because it all came from God to begin with, right? And so now I have this opportunity to go out into God's world, to carry his love, to carry his provision, to carry his blessing, and not just enrich my own life, but enrich the lives of those around me. Well, thank you, Pastor Brooks, for talking with us today about humility, and we will see you guys on the next episode.